The tribunal chamber of the Voker Dominion was an unforgiving place. Its high, metallic walls curved inward, trapping sound and suffocating hope. A dozen council members sat in a semicircle, their blue-black exoskeletal plates gleaming under the artificial lighting. Their luminous eyes, each a different shade of violet, bore into the man standing before them. David Carter had seen many things in his years as an Earth diplomat: corrupt bureaucracies, interspecies negotiations teetering on the brink of war, and alien traditions that defied human comprehension. But this was his first time standing trial for a crime he hadn't committed, in front of beings who had already decided he was guilty. Incontrovertible evidence has been presented against you, human, intoned Chancellor RYYZ, his voice vibrating in the deep, subsonic range of the Voker elite. You infiltrated our archives, extracted classified intelligence, and attempted to transmit it back to your kind. David gritted his teeth. That's a lie. A murmur rippled through the chamber. An almost imperceptible clicking of mandibles, a rustling of wings among the observing Voker elites. To them, his defiance was either foolishness or the arrogance of the guilty. RYYZ raised a segmented hand, silencing the chamber. Do not deny what has been proven. The footage of you accessing our secure database is undeniable. David clenched his fists. Footage? He had never even been near their classified systems. Someone had planted evidence, and they had done it well. Across the chamber, his only ally sat rigid, her translucent wing cape draped elegantly over her shoulders. Zireen of the Voker, the youngest diplomat to ever serve in the Dominion's Interstellar Relations Office, met his gaze with those piercing silver eyes. David didn't know why she was here. By all logic, she should have distanced herself from him the moment he was accused. Yet, she hadn't, and he could see the war raging behind her composed expression. Chancellor RYYZ, Zireen finally spoke, her voice smooth but firm. May I address the tribunal? The Chancellor regarded her. If you must. Zireen stood. This human was sent as a diplomat, not a spy. The punishment for espionage under our law is death. Are we to execute an envoy based on circumstantial evidence? RYYZ's compound eyes glowed. There is nothing circumstantial about it. Yet the accused maintains his innocence. As all guilty beings do. Zireen took a step forward. Chancellor, if the Dominion executes a human diplomat without the full weight of due process, the Terran Union will not remain silent. This could spark a conflict that we are unprepared for. David could almost see the tension ripple through the chamber. The Voker Dominion was powerful, but they were not invincible. War with Earth would be costly. RYYZ's mandibles clicked in thought. What do you propose, Ambassador Zireen? Zireen exhaled slowly. Allow me to conduct an independent investigation. If the evidence is truly incontrovertible, then surely you have nothing to fear. David held his breath. RYYZ considered for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. You have 3 cycles. If you do not produce compelling counter-evidence, the execution will proceed as planned. David barely suppressed the shiver, crawling up his spine. 3 cycles, roughly 72 Earth hours, to prove his innocence, or he would die. As the guards dragged him back to his holding cell, he locked eyes with Zireen one last time. And in that moment, he saw something he hadn't expected: determination. The cold blue glow of the detention center barely illuminated the cramped walls of David's cell. The energy restraints on his wrists pulsed with a quiet hum, designed to subdue any species unlucky enough to be bound by them. He didn't bother struggling. The door slid open, and Zireen stepped inside. You really think you can clear my name in 3 days? David asked dryly. Zireen's expression was unreadable. I don't know. That's comforting. She exhaled sharply, folding her arms. I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night you were accused. David shook his head. There's nothing to remember. I went back to my quarters after the trade summit. I didn't leave. If there's footage of me in your archives, it's fabricated. Zireen's silver eyes narrowed. Then someone went through a great deal of effort to frame you. No kidding. She paced, her translucent wing cape shimmering under the sterile light. Who benefits from your execution? Who would gain from a war between the Dominion and Earth? David frowned. Not the Dominion's leadership, I imagine. And the Terran Union certainly doesn't want war. There are factions in both governments that do, Zireen murmured. David swallowed. If someone is manufacturing evidence to push for war, then we are already in more danger than we realize. Silence hung between them. Zireen finally met his gaze. I will get you out of here, David, but you must trust me. David studied her for a long moment. He had spent his entire career navigating delicate alliances, but this was the first time someone outside his own species was risking everything to protect him. He nodded. Then let's find out who really wants me dead. Zireen moved quickly. She had little choice. 3 cycles would pass in the blink of an eye. If she failed, David would be publicly executed before the entire Dominion. Her first lead took her to the security archives, a vast network of encrypted data housed within the heart of the Voker capital. She used her diplomatic clearance to gain access, though she felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking her movements. The footage RYYZ had presented was damning. David, entering the restricted archive chamber at precisely 3:17, downloading classified data, then disappearing into the night. Except, something was off. Zireen played the footage again. The figure in the video moved like David, looked like David, but something was wrong. She slowed the playback. A flicker. Zireen's mandibles tightened. This wasn't raw security footage. It had been altered. She checked the metadata. The file had been accessed and edited just 2 cycles before David's arrest. The authorization code used belonged to someone within the Dominion's own intelligence division. Someone had framed David from within. Her wing cape twitched as realization settled in. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was treason. And if she wasn't careful, she would be the next to disappear. Zireen's mind raced as she exited the security archives, her wing cape fluttering behind her. The knowledge she now carried was dangerous. Someone within the Dominion's intelligence division had fabricated the evidence against David, and they had done so with meticulous precision. Her fingers brushed against the data chip concealed within her robes. If anyone discovered she had accessed the metadata logs, she would share David's fate. She needed to move carefully. Her first instinct was to take this directly to Chancellor RYYZ, but she hesitated. If this conspiracy reached into the Dominion's leadership, exposing it prematurely could get her silenced. No, she needed proof, something undeniable, and she needed help. As she stepped onto the transport pad leading to the lower districts of the Voker capital, she tapped a secure frequency on her comlink. A moment later, a familiar voice crackled through. I was wondering when you'd call, Zireen. I need to meet. Now. A pause. Then, same place as before. And hurry. The comlink cut off. Zireen exhaled and adjusted the hood of her robe, concealing her face as she stepped into the neon-lit underbelly of the city. The meeting place was an abandoned maintenance tunnel beneath the city's energy grid. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and damp metal, the only light coming from the flickering service panels lining the walls. She didn't wait long. A tall Voker emerged from the shadows, his carapace duller than it had once been, his violet eyes sharper. He was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, a reminder of the price he had paid for questioning the wrong people. Corinne, Zireen greeted. Ambassador. His mandibles clicked with amusement. I assume this isn't a social visit. Zireen handed him the data chip. Analyze the footage. Someone in Intelligence Division altered it to frame the human. Corinne's antennae twitched. You're playing a dangerous game. I don't have a choice. He studied her for a moment before nodding. Give me a cycle. If there's something buried in this file, I'll find it. Zireen clasped his arm. Be careful. Corinne smirked. I always am. She wasn't sure she believed him. Back in the detention center, David sat on the edge of his cot, studying the force field that separated him from freedom. 3 days to prove his innocence. More than a day had already passed. The cell door hissed open. David tensed, until he saw who it was. Zireen stepped inside, her silver eyes scanning him before speaking in a low voice. We don't have time. I'm getting you out of here. David blinked. I thought you were investigating. I am, but I no longer trust the process. If I leave you here, I may be handing you over to your executioners. David stood. So what's the plan? She tapped her wrist device. The force field flickered and died. David's eyebrows shot up. You have override access? Zireen allowed herself the barest smirk. I have many things. David didn't argue. He followed her into the corridor, where two unconscious guards lay slumped against the wall. You work fast, he muttered. They'll wake up soon. Move. They navigated through the detention complex, slipping past security patrols and automated drones. Zireen led him through an auxiliary maintenance corridor, where a small transport pod waited. This will take us to the lower districts, she said. Once there, we disappear. David hesitated. And then what? Zireen met his gaze. Then we find the ones who framed you, and we make them answer for it. David exhaled sharply. I like the sound of that. As they boarded the pod, alarms blared across the facility. Their escape had not gone unnoticed. The pod shot through the underground transit tunnels, a blur of motion and artificial gravity. David steadied himself against the seat. I assume there's a plan for when they realize we're missing? Zireen's fingers flew across the control panel. Yes. It involves not getting caught. David glanced at her. That's reassuring. She ignored him. Her focus was on the scanner, tracking Dominion patrols already moving to intercept them. This won't be a clean getaway, she muttered. A sudden impact rocked the pod. Warning lights flared. David gripped the console. That didn't sound good. Zireen cursed in Vocari. They've deployed pursuit drones. Another hit. The pod shuddered violently. David scanned the control panel. We can't outrun them, can we? No. Then we improvise. David reached for the manual override and slammed it. The pod lurched as emergency protocols disengaged. Suddenly, they were free-falling through the transit shaft. Zireen hissed. What did you just do? Made us unpredictable. The pod spiraled toward the depths of the city. The drones followed, until Zireen activated the stabilizers at the last possible moment. The pod slammed into a maintenance platform, scraping against metal before finally grinding to a halt. The drones, unable to adjust in time, shot past them into the abyss below. David let out a breath. Well, that worked. Zireen shot him a glare before yanking open the hatch. Move. They stepped out into the shadows of the lower district. A city of neon and steel stretched before them, chaotic, lawless, and perfect for hiding. For now, by the time they reached Corinne's safe house, the city was alive with the sounds of sirens and patrols. Inside, Corinne was waiting, his mandibles tight with urgency. I found something, he said, holding up a hollow projector. You were right. The footage was fabricated. Zireen's eyes narrowed. Who did it? Corinne activated the projection. A name appeared in alien script, glowing in the dim light. Zireen inhaled sharply. David frowned. What? Who is it? Zireen turned to him, her expression grim. The one who framed you, she said. The one orchestrating all of this. David followed her gaze to the name on the screen. And when he read it, he felt his blood run cold. It wasn't a Voker name. It was human. David stared at the name projected in glowing script. His breath caught in his throat. Ambassador Marcus Vance. For a moment, his mind refused to accept it. Vance was a senior diplomat in the Terran Union. His mentor, the man who had vouched for him when he first entered interstellar politics. And now he was the one who had orchestrated this entire setup? Zireen watched him carefully. You recognize the name? David's hands clenched into fists. Yeah, I do. Corinne shut off the hollow projector. Then you know what this means. David exhaled sharply. His mind raced through the possibilities. Why? Why would Vance do this? Had he been compromised? Bought off? Or had he always been playing a deeper game? I don't understand, he said finally. Vance was always a pragmatist, sure. But this? Framing me? Trying to start a war? Zireen's mandibles tightened. We need to find out if he acted alone. If he has allies in the Dominion or the Terran Union. Corinne crossed his arms. You'll have to be careful. If Vance set this up, then he'll know the moment you try to expose him. David's jaw tightened. Then we don't expose him yet. We go after proof. Hard evidence. Corinne gave a dry, chittering laugh. Easier said than done, human. David ignored him and turned to Zireen. We need to get off-world. Zireen studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I have a contact who can arrange transport. Corinne sighed. I'll work on covering your tracks. But if you're wrong about this, I'm not. David's voice was steady. Zireen met his gaze. Then let's move. The Dominion was on high alert. Patrols swept the streets, drones scanned every checkpoint, and travel restrictions had tightened overnight. David and Zireen moved through the underbelly of the city, their path carefully chosen to avoid surveillance. Every step felt like walking on a blade's edge. We won't make it through the spaceport undetected, Zireen murmured. David glanced around. Then what's the alternative? She nodded toward a towering industrial complex in the distance. The freight docks. Cargo haulers make off-world trips without as much scrutiny. David exhaled. Smuggling ourselves out in a cargo crate. Classy. Zireen smirked. Try not to complain too much. It might be the only reason you stay alive. They moved swiftly, ducking into a maintenance tunnel that led toward the freight docks. Halfway through, Zireen halted abruptly. David tensed. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Her head tilted slightly, her antennae twitching. Then she whispered, We're not alone. David's heart pounded. He didn't hear anything, but Zireen's senses were sharper than his. A shadow flickered in the dim corridor. Then the ambush began. The first attacker lunged from the darkness, a Voker clad in stealth armor, wielding an energy blade. Zireen reacted instantly. Her wing cape flared as she twisted, catching the attacker's arm and driving her own blade into their side. The Voker crumpled with a hiss. David ducked as another assassin lunged at him. He barely avoided the strike, grabbing a loose pipe from the wall and swinging it hard. The impact sent the attacker reeling. More shapes moved in the darkness. We have to go now, Zireen shouted. David didn't argue. They sprinted down the tunnel, dodging energy bolts as the assassins pursued. Zireen's comlink crackled. You have hostiles on you, Corinne's voice came through. No kidding, David shouted. I've got a distraction ready. Keep running. Ahead, a service hatch hissed open. Go, Zireen ordered. David dove through first, hitting the ground and rolling. Zireen followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as an explosion rocked the tunnel. The air filled with smoke and debris. Coughing, David pushed himself up. Tell me that was your distraction. Corinne's voice crackled through. You're welcome. Zireen exhaled sharply. That won't hold them forever. We need to reach the docks. David wiped sweat from his forehead. Then let's finish this. The freight docks were a chaotic mess of loading cranes, cargo containers, and overworked laborers. It was the perfect place to disappear. If they could reach their contact, Zireen led them to a docking platform where a battered freighter was being prepped for departure. A grizzled Voker pilot waited beside the ramp. His one remaining wing was folded against his back, and his yellow eyes gleamed with amusement. Zireen, he rasped, you always bring me the best trouble. Zireen smirked. And you always overcharge me for it, Tech. Tech's gaze flicked to David. The human. David forced a smile. I have a name, you know. Tech snorted. Don't care. Get on the ship before someone shoots you. David and Zireen hurried up the ramp. Tech sealed the hatch and strode to the cockpit. We're leaving now. Hold on to something. As the engines roared to life, Zireen turned to David. Once we're off-world, we find Vance. David nodded grimly. And when we do, we make him answer for what he's done. The freighter lifted off, cutting through the atmosphere and into the void. The hunt for the traitor had begun. The freighter shuddered as it punched through the planet's exosphere, its hull rattling under the strain of rapid acceleration. David gripped the side of his seat, casting a wary glance toward Tech, who piloted the ship with the casual arrogance of someone who had narrowly avoided death one too many times. The moment they breached the outer atmosphere, Zireen exhaled, her posture relaxing slightly. Any pursuit? Tech tapped a few controls, glancing at the scanner display. Nothing on our tail. Either you lost them on the ground, or they're waiting for you somewhere else. David frowned. They wouldn't give up that easily. If Vance has the Dominion's intelligence division in his pocket, he could be tracking us right now. Tech chuckled dryly. Then let's hope my ship's old enough to fly under their fancy sensors. Zireen turned toward David. We need a destination. David thought for a moment. If Vance had orchestrated this setup, he wouldn't be sitting on Voker Prime. He'd be somewhere safe, somewhere he could control the flow of information. His stomach twisted as realization dawned. Erebus Station. Zireen's antennae twitched. That black market hub in neutral space? It's more than that, David said. It's where back-channel deals happen, where information is traded in the dark. If Vance is handling this personally, he's doing it from somewhere unofficial. Tech let out a low whistle. You do realize Erebus Station is crawling with mercs, smugglers, and every kind of scum in the galaxy? David gave a humorless smile. Sounds like my kind of place. Tech shook his head. You humans are insane. Zireen smirked. Plot a course, Tech. The old pilot grumbled, but punched in the coordinates. The ship's engines flared, and moments later, they jumped into FDL. The hunt was on. David leaned against the viewport, watching the streaks of FTL travel blur past. His mind churned with unanswered questions. Why had Vance done this? What was his endgame? He felt Zireen step beside him. You're thinking too loudly. David sighed. I just keep going over it. Vance had everything. Power, influence, the trust of the Terran Union. Why throw it all away? Zireen studied him. Maybe he believes he's not throwing it away. David frowned. What do you mean? She crossed her arms. Not all betrayals are done for selfish reasons. Some people betray because they believe they are right. David exhaled. You think he actually believes what he's doing is justified? It's a possibility. David hated that answer, because it meant Vance wasn't just some greedy traitor. He was a true believer. And true believers were always the most dangerous. Then we need to know why he's doing this, David murmured. Zireen nodded. And we need to stop him before he succeeds. Erebus Station loomed against the backdrop of a dying red star. It was a massive, sprawling construct, an ancient deep space mining platform that had long since been abandoned by legitimate governments and claimed by the underworld. As Tech guided the freighter toward the docking ring, David spotted the flashing neon signs, the rusted hulls of scavenged ships, and the chaotic movement of thousands of individuals who lived in the lawless depths of the station. Zireen secured her diplomatic cloak, though it would do little to protect her here. We don't know who Vance is working with, so we stay quiet, move carefully. David checked his sidearm. Agreed. Tech powered down the ship. I'll keep the engines warm. Try not to get killed before you pay me. David and Zireen stepped into the dim corridors of Erebus Station. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Every shadow held a potential threat. They had entered the lion's den. And somewhere in this wretched hive of scum and villainy, Ambassador Marcus Vance was waiting. Erebus Station was a place where laws were flexible and loyalty was bought by the highest bidder. The corridors hummed with the murmur of 1,000 different languages, punctuated by the occasional shout of a deal gone bad or the hum of concealed energy weapons charging. David and Zireen moved cautiously through the station's maze of rusted catwalks and neon-lit alleys. The information they needed wouldn't be found in official records. It would be whispered in the dark, traded like currency. We need a contact, David muttered, scanning the crowd. Someone with access to intelligence networks. Zireen's antennae twitched. I know just the person. She led him deeper into the underbelly of the station, where the lighting dimmed and the air reeked of machine oil and ozone. They stopped outside a reinforced door with a flickering red glyph painted across its surface. David raised an eyebrow. Charming. Zireen pressed a sequence into the access panel. The door hissed open, revealing a room filled with glowing data streams, ancient servers, and a single figure lounging behind a curved control console. The figure was a Kethari, a lanky, reptilian species with cybernetic enhancements embedded into their skull. Their fingers, lined with neural implants, danced across a hollow interface as they barely glanced up. Well, the Kethari purred. Zireen of the Dominion, gracing me with her presence. Zireen crossed her arms. We need information, Celix. Celix's luminous green eyes flicked toward David. And the human? The human. The one with a death sentence on his head. David stiffened. So you've heard. Celix grinned, revealing needle-like teeth. Everyone on Erebus has heard, darling. There's a very large bounty for your capture. Or your corpse. David exhaled sharply. Good to know. Zireen stepped forward. We're looking for Marcus Vance. We know he's connected to the Dominion's intelligence division. Celix tilted their head. You're playing a dangerous game. Zireen's silver eyes remained steady. Are you going to help us or not? Celix tapped their fingers on the console. Vance is here, yes. But you won't like what I'm about to tell you. David leaned in. Try me. Celix smirked. He's not just hiding. He's meeting with someone. A representative of the Dominion's High Command. Zireen's expression darkened. Who? Celix flicked a holographic display into existence. A familiar face appeared. Chancellor RYYZ. David felt ice crawl up his spine. This goes all the way to the top. Zireen clenched her fists. Then we need proof. Where is the meeting happening? Celix gave a slow, calculating smile. Ah, my dear. That will cost you. Celix leaned back, watching them with lazy amusement. Information isn't free, especially when it involves men like Vance and RYYZ. David folded his arms. What do you want? The Ketheri's cybernetic fingers drummed against the console. There's a shipment of classified Dominion tech arriving at Dock 17 within the hour. Very valuable. I want it. Zireen's eyes narrowed. You're asking us to steal from the Dominion? Celix grinned. Oh, I knew you'd be fun. David exhaled. If we do this, you'll give us the meeting location? Every detail, Celix purred. But hurry, the window is closing. David glanced at Zireen. She met his gaze, silent for a moment. Then she nodded. Fine, she said. We'll get your shipment. Celix clapped their hands. Oh, I do love a good heist. The docking bay was heavily guarded, with Dominion soldiers overseeing the unloading of a large cargo freighter. The shipment, stacked in reinforced crates, was being transferred to an armored transport. David and Zireen observed from the shadows of a maintenance corridor. This is insane, David muttered. How are we supposed to steal from a high-security dock? Zireen's silver eyes flickered with calculation. Distraction, misdirection, and a bit of luck? David sighed. I hate plans that rely on luck. Zireen smirked. Then you'll hate what I'm about to do. Before he could stop her, she pressed a sequence on her wrist device. A second later, a loud explosion rocked the far side of the docking bay. Alarms blared. Soldiers scrambled toward the source of the disturbance. David stared at her. What the hell was that? Zireen simply strode forward. A contingency plan. David groaned and followed. They moved swiftly, weaving through the confusion. As guards rushed toward the explosion, the cargo transport was left with minimal security. Zireen disabled the last two guards with a precise strike, and David hauled the shipment onto an anti-grav lift. They moved quickly, pushing the stolen cargo toward the exit. Then the alarms changed. David's stomach dropped. They knew. We have to run, Zireen hissed. The moment they reached the corridor, a blast of energy scorched the wall beside them. Dominion enforcers had arrived, and they weren't taking prisoners. The chase through the station was chaos. David and Zireen weaved through corridors, ducking under hissing steam vents and leaping over cargo crates as Dominion enforcers closed in. Energy bolts screamed past them, searing through metal walls. Zireen slid into cover, activating a small device. The floor beneath their pursuers detonated, sending bodies flying. David blinked. Where do you keep getting explosives? Zireen smirked. Trade secret. They reached Celix's hideout, skidding to a halt as the Ketheri watched them with amusement. Oh, you really did it, Celix purred, inspecting the stolen cargo. You continue to surprise me, Zireen. Zireen scowled. We held up our end. Now tell us where Vance and RYYZ are meeting. Celix tapped a few commands into their holo display. A map of Erebus Station appeared. They're meeting in the upper-tier suites, private level. You'll need high-clearance access to get inside. David frowned. And I suppose you conveniently have a way in? Celix grinned. Of course. But that's another favor. Zireen glared. Give us the access, or I blast a hole through your data servers. Celix sighed dramatically. Fine, fine. No need for violence. A small chip ejected from the console. Zireen snatched it. "This will get you past the security checkpoints," Selleck said. "But be careful. If RYYZ and Vance are meeting in secret, it means everyone at the top is playing a game bigger than you realize." David tucked the access chip into his jacket. Zireen's voice was steel. "Then let's crash their little meeting." David nodded. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. By the end of the night, they would have the truth. Or they would be dead. The upper-tier suites of Erebus Station were a stark contrast to the chaos below. Here, the air was clean. The corridors lined with reinforced glass, and the security presence was subtle but absolute. David and Zireen moved with purpose, their stolen clearance chips granting them unchallenged access. The meeting was taking place in Suite 47V, an isolated chamber designed for high-level negotiations. They reached the entrance. A single guard stood outside, clad in sleek Dominion armor. Zireen moved first, striking with precision. The guard collapsed soundlessly. David caught him before he hit the ground, dragging him out of sight. Zireen placed a device on the suite security panel. The door hissed open. They stepped inside. And there he was, Marcus Vance. The former Terran diplomat sat at the head of a polished conference table, his features as composed as ever. Across from him stood Chancellor RYYZ, his blue-black exoskeleton gleaming under the room's sterile lights. They weren't alone. Two Dominion enforcers flanked the Chancellor. Another figure, a human intelligence officer, judging by his Union insignia, stood near Vance. The conversation halted the moment David and Zireen entered. Vance sighed. "I was wondering when you'd show up." David's fist clenched. "You set me up?" Vance's gaze remained calm. "Yes." Zireen stepped forward. "Why?" The Chancellor's mandibles twitched in amusement. "Because war is inevitable. We are merely accelerating the process." David's stomach tightened. "War? You think this will help?" Vance exhaled. "You're thinking too small, David. The Dominion and the Terran Union have been teetering on the edge of conflict for years. Political posturing, economic rivalries, border disputes, it's only a matter of time. But an outright war? That requires a catalyst. Something the people can rally behind." Zireen's voice was sharp. "You wanted my people to execute an innocent human diplomat, so that Earth would retaliate?" Vance inclined his head. "And it would have worked, had you not interfered." David shook his head. "You're insane." "No," Vance corrected. "I'm pragmatic." He gestured to the intelligence officer beside him. "The Union needs this war. The Dominion needs this war. If we engineer the right conflict, we can control it, shape the outcome, prevent the kind of prolonged, bloody struggle that would destroy both sides." David's blood ran cold. "You actually believe that?" Vance's eyes hardened. "I believe in necessity." RYYZ clicked his mandibles. "And you, Ambassador Zireen, you have placed yourself on the wrong side of history." The Chancellor motioned to his enforcers. David's instinct screamed. He reached for his weapon. Too late. A stun round slammed into his chest. His body locked up, muscles seizing. He crumpled to the ground, unable to move. Zireen barely had time to react before the second enforcer struck. She twisted, dodging the first blow, but the second hit her square in the abdomen. She gasped, staggering. Vance stood, straightening his suit. "A shame. You were both promising." He turned to RYYZ. "Make it clean." RYYZ's mandibles curved in what could almost be called a smile. "Of course." The last thing David saw before darkness took him was the enforcers closing in. David awoke to the sound of distant alarms. His head throbbed, his limbs still weak from the stun charge. Dim lighting flickered overhead. He was in a holding cell, smooth walls, reinforced containment field, no obvious way out. Across from him, Zireen was regaining consciousness, her silver eyes fluttering open. She groaned. "We're alive?" David swallowed. "For now." A voice crackled over the intercom. "I'd say you owe me, human." David recognized it instantly. "Corinne?" The security panel on the cell door fizzled, then short-circuited. A moment later, the force field dropped. Zireen sat up fast. "How did you?" Corinne's voice was smug. "I always have contingencies." David didn't wait for explanations. He helped Zireen up, and they bolted from the cell. Corinne's voice guided them. Vance and RYYZ are evacuating. They know you're free. David's pulse quickened. Where are they? Landing bay. Private transport. If you don't stop them now, you never will. Zireen exchanged a look with David. No words were needed. They ran. The landing bay was a storm of activity, guards scrambling, engines roaring to life. At the center of it all, Marcus Vance was boarding a sleek diplomatic cruiser, RYYZ at his side. David and Zireen burst into the bay. The guards turned, too slow. Zireen's weapon fired first, dropping one, then another. David took aim at Vance. The older diplomat paused at the ramp of the ship, locking eyes with him. For the first time, David saw something beneath Vance's polished composure. Not fear, not regret, conviction. You can't stop what's coming, Vance said. David's jaw clenched. Watch me. He fired. Vance moved, but the shot wasn't meant for him. The blast hit the ship's fuel conduit. An explosion rocked the bay. Fire and smoke consumed the vessel. Vance and RYYZ disappeared into the inferno. David turned away as the blast waves surged outward. It was over. Or so he thought. 3 days later, the Terran Union received word of a tragic incident on Erebus Station. A Dominion ship had been destroyed. A high-ranking chancellor had perished. The details were unclear, but the implications were obvious. Across the Dominion, outrage spread like wildfire. On Earth, military fleets were mobilized. The war that Vance had planned, the war he had wanted, had begun. David sat in the shadows of a dimly lit bar, watching the news unfold. His face was now one of the most wanted in the galaxy. Zireen sat beside him, her expression unreadable. We stopped Vance, she said quietly. David took a slow sip of his drink. Did we? Because as he watched the fleets move, as he listened to the war drums sound, he realized that Marcus Vance had won.